I was watching an episode of Doctor Who a while ago, and the Doctor was trying to stop a supervillain who was just completely focused on revenge, on identifying transgressions that had not been punished by the law and taking vengeance into his own hands. Now, you might not be a Doctor Who fan, but you know the sort. Now, this supervillain tried to justify his vengeance by quoting the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament. And he said, and very predictably, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And the doctor replied, that's the Old Testament. There's a twist in the sequel. Love your neighbour. A twist in the sequel. Now, you've been listening to my sermons long enough to know that I can't let that go. The message of the scriptures is seamless in its transition from Old to New Testament, from Jewish scriptures to Christian scriptures. The same God, the same message, the same people messing the same things up. But for a lot of people, the Old Testament is all about vengeance and judgment. But the New Testament sets a course correction in the narrative. Now it's all about love. Well, that's how a lot of people view the Bible, isn't it? And it is a very common view, but common views have been known to be wrong. And this one could not be more wrong. And that made me sad, because the doctor is supposed to be super, super, super smart. She would never have made a dumb mistake like that. But she was really let down by her scriptwriters. The real doctor would know that when Jesus said, love your neighbour, he wasn't introducing a plot twist. He was quoting from the Old Testament. Leviticus 19:18, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. There it is, in the third book of the Jewish scriptures. Love was not a new idea that started with Jesus or with the New Testament. It was there all along, right from the beginning. It was always the dominant plot line in all of God's dealings with people. And so when Jesus said that all the commandments are summed up in these two commandments, to love God and love your neighbour, he meant exactly that all of the commandments, all of the Old Testament, everything that has been spoken from the beginning by God, had been given to illustrate what it looks like to love God and love one's neighbour. Love means we don't worship other gods. And love means we don't commit murder or adultery or theft. You don't do those things to the people you love. Love means that when we are called on to judge, we judge strictly according to the truth, without prejudice, without self-interest, without allowing ourselves to be intimidated by people with power or money. Love means we don't slander each other. If someone does something wrong, we challenge them. We don't talk behind their backs. We don't use passive-aggressive means to hurt them and then smile innocently when we see them next. Love means we never, ever allow ourselves to benefit from another person's suffering. Leviticus 19:16, you shall not profit from the blood of your neighbour. Now let that sink in. Do you ever profit from another person's suffering? How many of the privileges and benefits you have enjoyed in this life have been purchased at someone else's expense? Do you know for certain, even this morning, that there was no slavery or exploitation involved in the production of the clothes that you are wearing, the food that you will eat for lunch, the furniture and appliances you will use in your home today? We live in a world in which the exploitation of vulnerable people is so woven into the fabric of our economic lives that we feel uncomfortable about those questions because we don't even know where to start if we were to try to obey that command. And don't you sometimes feel a bit judged when social justice warriors come along and ask questions like that? Questioning your purchasing choices, your support of the fossil fuels industry, your lifestyle. They shouldn't judge you, should they? Because Jesus said we should love one another. Judging is an Old Testament thing, isn't it? But how do you untangle love from judgment? If we love the people and other creatures we share this world with who are exploited, marginalized, or abused, if we are to love them, actually love them, not just think nice thoughts about them, but love them, to do what we can to get justice for them, are we not obliged to encourage the people around us to also do what they can? Even if that means sounding a bit judgy sometimes. And doesn't seeking justice inevitably involve holding the perpetrators of injustice accountable? Justice cannot be disentangled from love. They are two sides of the one coin. There cannot be justice without love. And there is most certainly no real love without justice. Think about the violence in Gaza at the moment. There is a real danger that a cycle of revenge might spiral and spiral until there is nothing left there and nobody left to pick up the pieces. What is the alternative? What would the path of love even look like if Netanyahu and the leaders of Hamas were to choose to walk it? Sometimes revenge is a path that people take when justice has been thwarted. Now, I'm not for a moment, please don't misunderstand me, I'm absolutely not saying it is ever okay. It is absolutely not. But I am saying that the people who choose to deny justice to desperate people play a part in pushing those desperate people toward desperate deeds. There can be no peace without justice. There can be no love without justice. That is true for us in our social and political relationships. Is it not also true of God? Can God really be said to love exploited people if God overlooks the behavior of the people who are exploiting them? God cannot be loving without condemning the people who cause harm. That is not love, that is indifference. We mustn't forget, of course, that all our wrongdoings can be thrown away in a moment by God's grace. But to enter into the reconciliation that God invites us into, to do that, we must turn from injustice. We must repent and set our feet firmly on the path of love. It makes no sense to say that the Old Testament is about judgment and the New Testament is about love. Love and justice are intertwined through every page of the Scriptures, old and new, and in every day of God's interaction with creation. And that reminds me of one of my favourite stories. I've told it here before, but it was a few years ago and it's worth hearing again every few years. I have favourite novels that I read almost every year, so hopefully you'll be okay with hearing this one again. It is an old story. I don't know how old, maybe 1,000 years old, maybe a few decades, I've no idea. But the story is set much, much earlier. It is set way back before Abraham. It is a story about how God chose the site of the temple in Jerusalem. It's a story about two brothers who owned a flour mill and operated it together after the death of their parents. So these two brothers lived on either side of a hill, and their flour mill was right on the top of the hill. And each day at the end of the workday, once they'd milled all the wheat into flour and they'd sold all the flour that people came to buy, they would equally divide the profits and then equally divide the flour that had been produced. And so they each, in their own homes, had storerooms where they would store their flour, and then from there they could each either use the flour or sell it. And in that way they made sure that it was completely just and equitable as the two brothers operated this mill together. And but the two brothers were really quite different from each other. The first brother, who lived on this side of the hill, he was married, had a wife who he loved dearly, and he had 10 children, a huge family, and the house was full of chaos and noise, and he loved every minute of it. And the other brother, on the other side of the hill, had not married, and he lived alone. So they lived very different lives. And so the brother on this side of the hill started to reflect on this situation, where they had such different lives, different needs, and yet they were dividing the profits from the mill so completely equally. And so as he reflected, he came to the point where he said, no, this is not fair, this situation. It is not fair. It's not fair to be dividing the profits equally when I have this wonderful life. My life is full of so much joy and people who love me, and our life is so good. And it's not fair because I have so much, and my brother on the other side of the hill, he has so little. That's not fair. And so he would, once everything in the house was eventually quiet and the children were sleeping and his wife was sleeping, he would very quietly creep out of his house. He would go to his own storeroom where he kept his share of the flour. He would pull out a big bag of flour, carry it on his back up to the top of the hill, and then down the other side to his brother's house. And he would very quietly open the door to his brother's storeroom. He'd put that bag of flour in, then he would slowly and quietly walk back over the hill to his own house, and he would go to sleep among his own family. And meanwhile, on the other side, his brother reflected. It had been the will of their parents that they would equally share the profits of the mill, but it's not fair. It was not fair that should be the case. His brother had this huge family to feed, so many more demands on his money and resources than he had. It was not fair that they should equally share these the profits of the mill. And so he would wait at night until all the noise from the other side of the hill would quiet down, and he knew that his brother was asleep with his family. And he would climb. He would go to his own storeroom, take out a big bag of flour, carry it on his back all the way up over the hill and down the other side to his brother's house. And he would very quietly open the door of his brother's storeroom, put that big bag of flour in and close the door, and satisfied that things were now more just, more fair, he would climb back over the hill to his own house and go to bed. Now, this happened every night for years and years. Each brother would seek to make their situation more fair by taking a bag of flour and putting it in their brother's storeroom. And then, after decades of this, for some reason, one of the brothers went to bed earlier than usual or stayed up later or whatever happened. But this night, they met at the top of the hill. They saw each other, each carrying their big bag of flour. And they suddenly realized what had been happening night after night after night for decades. They put down their bags of flour and they embraced each other and they cried. And God said, "That is where I'm going to build my temple." As it turned out, the temple didn't really exemplify the meeting place of love and justice that story tells of. In the actual temple, there was too much love of money, too little justice. But perfect love and perfect justice did meet in a person who sat in the temple courts in the early 1st century and taught the people, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Amen.